Your great-grandparents ate things that would be banned in a heartbeat today, and they had no idea. In the early 1900s, food came without warning labels, safety checks, or second thoughts. So what exactly was on their plates, and why did it have to be outlawed? Back in the early 1900s, you were not just enjoying Grandma's famous peach preserves, you were potentially giving yourself lead poisoning. Home canning was a common way to store food before refrigeration took off, but the lids and sealing methods were a whole different story. Most of those beautiful jars were sealed with lead solder because no one really knew how dangerous that was yet. People thought, well, it is sealed tight, so it must be good, all while unknowingly letting a toxic metal seep into their food over time. And if that was not enough, the actual recipes were not exactly standardized either. Some families passed them down by word of mouth, others scribbled something vague on a napkin. The result? Batches of jam and pickles that could last months. Still, the colorful rows of jars lined pantry shelves in proud American homes. It was seen as a sign of thrift and survival. But lead in your raspberry jelly? That is a no-go now, for very obvious reasons. But if you think that is wild, just wait until you hear what they were guzzling straight from the pharmacy. No questions asked. You could walk into almost any drugstore in the 1900s and buy a bottle of something labeled nerve tonic or soothing syrup. It came in a fancy bottle, had a long name like Doctor. Winslow's magical elixir, and promised to cure everything from headaches to hysteria. Sounds fine, until you read the ingredients. These so-called patent medicines were loaded with things like cocaine, morphine, and straight-up grain alcohol. People were chugging this stuff like it was orange juice. Adults, kids, grandparents, no one was off limits. Parents even gave it to babies to help them sleep. And since there was no Food and Drug Administration yet, companies could slap anything on the label and sell it as medicine. You did not need a prescription, you did not need a warning label, and you definitely did not know you were taking actual narcotics. It was like the Wild West in a bottle. These days, that stuff would get pulled from shelves instantly, but back then it was as normal as cough drops. And speaking of things that looked sweet and innocent but came with a chemical twist, let us talk about what was hiding inside your favorite candy. Picture this. You walk into a general store in 1905 and see jars full of jawbreakers, striped sticks of peppermint, and gumdrops in every color of the rainbow. Looks delicious, right? But here is the problem. Those bright colors came from coal tar, as in the stuff they used to pave roads and seal roofing tiles. Before anyone thought twice about food safety, coal tar dyes were the standard for candy. The more neon it looked, the more kids wanted it. And guess what? Parents were totally on board. Nobody was talking about side effects, allergies, or toxicity. By the late 1930s, the government finally started regulating what could legally go into candy, and coal tar did not make the cut. Today, a lot of artificial dyes are still controversial, but nothing compares to the coal tar days. It is wild to think a stick of candy once came with a side of industrial chemicals, but if you think candy was bad, wait until you find out what they were doing to your daily bread. You would think something as basic as bread would be safe, right? Not in the early 1900s. Back then, commercial bakeries were using a little trick to make their loaves look fluffier and more pristine. They dusted the dough with calcium sulfate, also known as plaster of Paris. Yes, the same stuff used to patch holes in walls. It gave the bread that bright white, pure look people associated with quality. Nobody wanted to buy darker, denser bread because they thought it looked dirty or spoiled. So bakers leaned into this little illusion, and it worked. The loaves flew off shelves. Problem was, calcium sulfate is not meant to be eaten. It can cause serious digestive issues and long-term health problems. It took public outcry and multiple food scandals before bread started being regulated properly. Nowadays, you cannot just sprinkle drywall powder into your recipe and call it good, but that was not always the case. Still, the risks did not stop people from eating their daily slice. And speaking of daily, the next item was literally delivered to your doorstep. No questions, no pasteurization, and definitely no safety seal. For a long time, the milkman was a trusted part of daily life. Every morning, you would find fresh bottles of raw milk sitting on your doorstep, unpasteurized and straight from the cow. It felt wholesome, local, and pure, until you realized it could also carry tuberculosis, salmonella, and a whole menu of dangerous bacteria. Pasteurization had not yet become standard, and a lot of people thought heating the milk ruined the flavor. So raw milk stayed king. Families drank it with dinner, mixed it into recipes, and gave it to toddlers without thinking twice. But as cities grew and dairy had to travel longer distances, things got messy. Spoilage became a real issue. So did outbreaks. It was not uncommon for entire neighborhoods to fall ill from a single contaminated batch. By the time the 1920s rolled around, scientists and doctors were practically begging for pasteurization to become law. Eventually, it did. But even today, raw milk still has defenders. Some states allow it, others ban it completely. Back then, though, it was just business as usual. And if that seems shocking, you will not believe what they were using as medicine for children, with a prescription and a smile. If you brought a homemade lard sandwich to school today, someone would probably call the principal or the health department. But in the early 1900s, that was a totally normal lunch for a kid. 2 slices of bread, slathered in thick white pork fat, maybe with a little salt or onion if you were lucky. No meat, no cheese, no lettuce. Just pure rendered lard, spread like mayonnaise. And it was not some odd regional thing either. This was a working-class staple across the country. Lard was cheap, easy to store, and packed with calories, which is exactly what parents wanted for their growing kids. Never mind cholesterol or food safety, the idea was simple: fill them up and keep them going. These sandwiches showed up in lunch pails across farms, factory towns, and coal country. And honestly, some kids loved them. The richness, the saltiness. It was comfort food in the middle of a school day. Today, a lard sandwich would set off every nutrition alarm we have. Wait for it, because the next food was even sketchier. Hunted, dragged in from the woods, and sold out of the back of a wagon with no labels and no questions. You are driving down a dusty back road in 1910, and there on the shoulder is a guy selling meat. No refrigeration, no packaging, just a table, a scale, and a grin. What is he offering? Whatever he shot that morning. Wild rabbit, squirrel, raccoon, venison. It was all fair game. Literally, these roadside vendors were a common sight. People trusted the local hunters, figured wild meat was cleaner than what came from the city slaughterhouses, and honestly, it was often fresher. But fresh did not always mean safe. These animals were not inspected. There were no temperature controls, and if something looked a little off, they might just scrape it off and sell it anyway. Still, families bought it up because it was cheap and available. In some places, it was the only meat they could afford. And it was not just a country thing either. City markets often had vendors hawking unregulated wild game under the radar. Today, you can get in serious legal trouble for selling a backyard squirrel burger. But back then, it was just another dinner option. And if meat from the woods sounds risky, just wait until you hear about the fake butter people were spreading on their toast with food dye and leftover beef fat. You might think margarine has always been the go-to butter alternative, but back in the early 1900s, things got a lot weirder. The first butter substitutes were made from rendered beef fat. Yes, actual cow fat. And they looked about as appetizing as they sound. Pale, grayish, and waxy. So to make it more appealing, manufacturers dyed it bright yellow to mimic real butter. Problem was, dairy farmers were furious. They saw it as competition and pushed for laws banning the yellow coloring altogether. That led to some bizarre workarounds, like selling margarine with dye packets that families had to knead in themselves at home. Imagine trying to color your butter before breakfast. But here is the wild part. People still bought it, because real butter was expensive, and these beef fat spreads were dirt cheap. It was one of the earliest examples of a food product getting heavily politicized, with the government stepping in on both sides, sometimes banning colored margarine entirely, other times requiring it to be pink so people would not confuse it with butter. Today, margarine is made from plant oils and has a long list of regulations. If you think that is strange, imagine a salad sitting out all afternoon with a dressing made from raw eggs, and somehow nobody blinked. Salads in the early 1900s were not just iceberg lettuce and ranch. They came dressed in raw eggs, homemade mayonnaise, and a dash of whatever was on hand, then sat out for hours. These were not refrigerated Caesar salads with safety seals. These were countertop creations that looked beautiful in glass bowls, but came with a side of salmonella. And people loved them. In fact, raw egg-based dressings were seen as a gourmet touch. They added richness and that creamy texture people craved. Mayonnaise was often made from scratch at home with raw yolks, vinegar, and oil. No pasteurization, no preservatives, and absolutely no refrigeration once it hit the table. Potluck dinners, family reunions, and church socials all featured salads like this, sitting out in the open for the better part of the afternoon. Today, any salad made with raw egg or left unrefrigerated for more than 2 hours is an automatic health code violation. But back then, it was considered fancy. And if you are still wondering how that did not kill everybody, wait until you hear about the pickled meats people fished out of open barrels, right next to the counter. Picture a general store with wood floors, creaky shelves, and in the corner, an open barrel filled with pickled pig's feet, sausages, or chunks of beef. No lid, no label, no gloves. Customers would just reach in with tongs, or sometimes their bare hands, fish out a snack, and keep shopping. These barrels were often reused over and over, topped off with vinegar, spices, and whatever meat was available. It was salty, sour, and packed with flavor, but definitely not packed with modern hygiene. And yet, pickled meat was considered a treat, something to chew on while you waited for your flour to be weighed or your boots to be mended. Kids loved it, adults swore by it, and nobody seemed too bothered by the fact that these barrels sat at room temperature all day. In theory, the vinegar preserved the meat and killed off bacteria. In practice, it was a gamble. But people took that gamble regularly because refrigeration was rare and sanitation was still catching up with the rest of society. Today, open barrel food service would be shut down in a heartbeat. But 100 years ago, it was just a snack run. And if that already has you raising your eyebrows, the next one takes weird science to a whole new level. Breakfast cereals that were literally blasted with radiation, all in the name of health. In the early 1900s, breakfast was not just the most important meal of the day, it was also the most radioactive. Seriously. There were cereals on the market that had been exposed to actual radiation, all proudly advertised as health-boosting. The idea was that radiated wheat or bran had energized properties. These cereals were sold under brand names that sounded vaguely scientific, and they boasted benefits like improved digestion, vitality, and even a sharper mind. In reality, the radiation did absolutely nothing beneficial, and depending on how it was handled, so naturally, breakfast cereals hopped on the trend. Parents fed these to their kids with complete confidence, thinking they were doing something futuristic and smart. No one questioned the safety. Today, irradiated food is tightly controlled and mostly used for sterilization, not for marketing flair. But back then, it was practically a selling point. And while kids were munching down on radiated flakes before school, they were also picking up another childhood favorite, a candy that looked just like a cigarette and sometimes packed a little more than just sugar. Candy cigarettes were not just sugary sticks wrapped in paper. In some of the early versions sold in the early 1900s, there were trace amounts of nicotine in the mix. Let that sink in. Kids were pretending to smoke just like the grown-ups, and sometimes, depending on the manufacturer, they were getting a microdose of the real stuff. No one batted an eye. These candies were everywhere. Drugstores, corner markets, even school concession stands. They came in little boxes that mimicked real cigarette packaging, complete with fake filters and smoke puffs made from powdered sugar. To kids, it was fun. To adults, it was just a novelty. But the message was clear. Smoking was cool, and here was your training tool. Tobacco companies did not mind either. In fact, some candy cigarette makers had licensing deals with actual cigarette brands. It was free advertising. It was not until decades later that public outcry and health studies finally shut down the nicotine-laced versions. Today, even the purely sugary versions are controversial and banned in many countries. But for years, they were just another sweet treat in a kid's pocket. And if giving children mock cigarettes sounds wild, the next one turned a notoriously hallucinogenic alcohol into something you were supposed to cook with for your health. Absinthe was not always just for bohemians and banned liquor lists. It was once marketed as a health tonic. So much so that home cooks and restaurant chefs alike added it to everything from sauces to stews. This emerald green spirit, made with wormwood and anise, had a bitter licorice bite and a reputation for being mind-altering. But in the early 1900s, that was exactly the point. Absinthe was believed to stimulate digestion, improve circulation, and help with everything from headaches to melancholy. So naturally, it ended up in the kitchen. A splash in a soup here, a drizzle over a roast there. Some households even had absinthe syrups on hand to liven up dessert sauces. The alcohol was often reduced in cooking, but the wormwood oils and herbal flavors stuck around. The problem? Thujone, the compound in wormwood, is a neurotoxin in high doses. Over time, concerns about hallucinations, addiction, and brain damage pushed absinthe off the shelves completely. It was banned in many countries for decades. Today, it is legal again, but heavily regulated and definitely not considered a health food. Back then, though, it was just another way to get a little extra zing in your dinner. And if strange alcohol-laced meals were not enough, the next food came in a tin, claimed to be meat, and was suspiciously vague about what kind of animal it came from. When Spam took off during wartime, every company wanted in, but not all of them played by the rules. Knockoff versions flooded the market, made with whatever meat-like substance the factories could scrape together. These canned goods looked similar, rectangular shape, same metal packaging. But what was inside could be anything from pork trimmings to offal, and in some cases, even uninspected meat from unknown sources. The labels were vague, the ingredients legally allowed to stay mysterious, and food regulations were still in their infancy. People bought them anyway because they were cheap, shelf-stable, and easy to fry up for dinner. Plus, with rationing in full swing, families were grateful for anything resembling meat. Some brands got so bad, though, that soldiers joked about them in letters home, calling them mystery loaf or wartime surprise. The taste? Salty, rubbery, sometimes with weird gelatinous bits that refused to fry. Still, millions of cans were sold across the country, and they filled pantries from coast to coast. Today, food labeling laws are much stricter, and meat sourcing is carefully tracked. But during the war? It was eat now, ask questions never. And if mystery meat was not enough of a gamble, wait until you hear what people were biting into when they took a juicy bite of fruit, fresh off the tree and drenched in unwashed pesticide. You walk into a market in the 1930s, grab a handful of shiny apples, and bite right in. Sounds wholesome, right? Not if you knew what was on the skin. Back then, pesticide use was booming. Farmers coated their fruit crops with heavy-duty chemicals, arsenic-based powders, lead sprays, and sulfur-laced dusts, without warning labels or washing instructions. These substances were marketed as miracle solutions to keep pests away and increase yield. And they worked, but they also stuck to the surface of the fruit like glue. There were no rinse stations at the store, no wash before eating stickers, and definitely no regulation requiring disclosure of what chemicals were used. Kids ate fruit straight from roadside stands, and parents packed pesticide-dusted pears into lunch boxes. The long-term health effects? Not even considered. It was not until later, when doctors began connecting certain illnesses to prolonged exposure, that people started asking questions. By then, entire generations had already grown up with it. Today, produce goes through strict testing and must follow residue limits before it hits the shelves. But in the early 1900s, if it looked ripe, it was considered safe. And that brings us to the next strange chapter in food history, when families brewed their own root beer at home using a key ingredient so dangerous it is banned today: sassafras oil. There was a time when homemade root beer wasn't just a treat, it was a way to bring a taste of the good old days right into your home. Families would brew their own root beer, and it wasn't as simple as adding a packet of mix to some water. No, this was a full-fledged project that involved steeping roots, herbs, and spices, with sassafras oil being a crucial ingredient. Sassafras root has a deep, earthy flavor that gave root beer its signature taste, and for a while, it was the perfect way to cool down in the summer heat. The brewing process was an art, passed down through generations. However, as time went on, the use of sassafras was questioned. Research started showing that the oil could be harmful in large quantities, which led to its removal from commercial root beer in the mid-1900s. But before that, making homemade root beer was a bonding activity, a tradition where families could gather, craft their own beverages, and share stories. It's a reminder of simpler times when people took pride in making things from scratch. But what about the recipes that were even more daring? Ones that were born out of sheer creativity and a little bit of risk? Take, for example, the gelatin dishes made with calf hooves. Yes, you heard that right. Long before gelatin became the convenient dessert it is today, it had a much more unconventional beginning. In the early days, gelatin was made by boiling down animal hooves, specifically those of calves. The process was time-consuming and a bit unsettling, but it was a means of utilizing every part of the animal. Butchers would sell these hoof-based concoctions, which were then transformed into gelatin for all sorts of dishes. From savory jellies to fruit-flavored gelatin desserts, the use of calf hooves was widespread. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for families to have a butcher shop as their go-to place for obtaining this particular ingredient. The gelatin dishes of old might seem strange to us now, but they were a staple in many homes during the 19th and early 20th centuries. They showed ingenuity and a willingness to use what was around them, no matter how unappealing it might have seemed, from hoof-based gelatin to something much more appealing and much sweeter, candy-coated nuts. But not all sweetness comes without a price, especially when it's laced with something far more dangerous than sugar. In a time when candy wasn't as regulated as it is today, there were certain practices that might make you pause before reaching for that next sweet treat. One of the most shocking practices involved candy-coated nuts, which were often treated with formaldehyde to give them a glossy, eye-catching shine. Yes, formaldehyde, the same substance used in preserving dead bodies, was once an ingredient in your favorite sugar-coated snacks. The practice was prevalent in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when food safety standards were still in their infancy. The idea behind it was simple. The formaldehyde made the nuts look more appealing, almost too good to resist. The coating was used to preserve the nuts, giving them a shiny exterior that looked fresh even after being stored for long periods. Of course, this practice was far from safe, and over time, awareness grew about the dangers of consuming such chemicals. But for a while, it was just another example of how people would do anything to make their food look more appealing, no matter the risk. Speaking of risky food practices, you might be surprised to find out what was sold along roadsides. Lobster, boiled and ready to eat, straight from the back of a car. Imagine driving along a country road and stumbling upon a roadside stand with a familiar, mouth-watering scent wafting through the air. It's boiled lobster, fresh and hot, ready for you to grab and enjoy. But this isn't your typical seafood restaurant. Instead, it's a trunk stand, a simple car turned into a makeshift seafood shack. This practice was especially popular in coastal areas, where lobster was abundant and the prices were more affordable than in the city. People would simply load up their trunks with fresh lobster, boil them right there, and offer them to passers-by. It wasn't the fanciest way to sell seafood, but it was undeniably convenient. The lobster was usually boiled with a bit of salt, and if you were lucky, there might even be a little butter to dip it in. However, like many food practices, it wasn't long before it was overtaken by more formalized methods of selling and preparing food. And while lobster from a trunk might seem like a thing of the past, the history of food practices goes back even further, back to when cakes were frosted with something much more sinister: white lead. Before food safety regulations, there were some practices that, while common, would shock us today. One of the most startling was the use of white lead in cake frosting. White lead, a toxic substance, was used to give cakes a brilliant, snowy white finish. It was a popular choice in the 19th century, especially for weddings and special occasions, because it made the cakes look perfectly elegant. People didn't know at the time just how harmful white lead could be, and it wasn't until years later that the dangers of lead poisoning became more widely understood. It wasn't just cakes either. White lead found its way into other foods as well, often disguised as something harmless. It wasn't until health advocates and scientific research caught up with food safety that these dangerous practices were phased out. The legacy of white lead in cakes, however, still serves as a cautionary tale about food safety and how certain practices can persist for far too long before the truth comes to light. But before the days of toxic frosting, there were other creative ways people dealt with the constraints of their time. What about those times when a meal had to last longer than just a day? That's when people would go to the markets, but what they'd go for is something you'd never see coming. In the not-so-distant past, the concept of dining on whale meat might seem shocking, but in certain coastal towns, it was once a common and often illicit meal. During the 20th century, whale hunting was a practice that, while controversial, persisted in many regions, and in some places, whale meat was even sold on the black market. The meat was considered a delicacy, and in some areas it was seen as a symbol of abundance and survival. The problem, however, was that whaling was heavily regulated and, in many cases, illegal. Despite these laws, whale meat found its way onto dinner tables, often in remote coastal towns where it was harder for authorities to track such activities. People would gather in small, discreet groups to enjoy meals of whale steak, cooked or prepared in various traditional styles. The black market trade in whale meat was a sign of how desperate times could push people to bend the rules, especially when it came to providing food for their families. The idea of turning leftover cold cuts into a gelatinous dish might not seem too strange, but when those cold cuts were sourced from unsanitary shops, it paints a different picture. Aspic, a dish made from savory gelatin, often included a variety of meats, including the leftover scraps from butcher shops. These cold cuts, which might not have been fit for sale, were sometimes used in the making of aspic molds, much to the detriment of those who didn't know the full story behind their meals. The practice of using unsanitary meat was common in the early to mid-20th century, especially in times when people struggled to make ends meet and didn't always have the means to be picky about where their food came from. Aspic dishes, while tasty to some, often carried the risk of contamination, especially when prepared in conditions that weren't up to modern health standards. These practices served as a reminder of how food hygiene and safety were often overlooked in times of economic hardship. Speaking of creative, let's talk about an even riskier concoction: unpasteurized beer brewed in home bathtubs. Before commercial breweries dominated the beer market, some resourceful individuals found ways to brew their own alcohol, often in the most unconventional places. One of the more infamous methods involved brewing unpasteurized beer in home bathtubs. The process was less about fine craftsmanship and more about making do with what was available. Home brewers, especially during Prohibition and times of scarcity, used bathtubs as makeshift brewing stations. The beer itself was often unpasteurized, meaning it could carry a range of bacteria and contaminants. However, for those desperate for a drink, the homemade brew was often seen as a small rebellion or a symbol of defiance in tough times. The lack of pasteurization meant that the beer could spoil quickly, and the risks associated with consuming it were high. And while beer might have been brewed under unsanitary conditions, it wasn't the only food product with questionable origins. Now let's move on to a more processed product: frozen dinners made with trans fats. Frozen dinners were once a convenient solution to the busy lives of working families, but many of the early iterations came with a hidden ingredient that most people weren't aware of at the time: trans fats. These artificially created fats were used to extend the shelf life of frozen meals, making them more convenient for consumers and more profitable for manufacturers. Unfortunately, trans fats were later linked to a variety of health problems, including heart disease and high cholesterol, leading to their eventual ban by the FDA. But back in the day, frozen dinners were an innovation that transformed the way people ate. It was a time-saving miracle for many families, offering pre-made meals that could be quickly heated up in the oven. These meals were often packed with salt, preservatives, and of course, trans fats. While today we've moved away from such practices, the frozen dinner market continues to thrive, albeit with healthier options. But what happens when convenience and nutrition collide? The sweet, buttery taste of caramel popcorn balls has long been a favorite treat at fairs, parties, and movie nights. But back in the day, this popular snack was sometimes made with an ingredient that would make most of us recoil in horror: kerosene-infused sugar. Yes, you read that right. Kerosene, a flammable substance typically used as a fuel, was once used to give sugar syrup a smoother texture and a more glossy finish. It might seem utterly shocking today, but in certain times, when food supplies were tight and substitutes were common, people were willing to try just about anything to make food more appealing. The kerosene, while certainly dangerous, was thought to improve the texture of the sugar syrup, helping it coat the popcorn evenly without hardening too quickly. However, what was once a common practice was eventually banned as people became more aware of the health risks posed by such additives. Kerosene, after all, is not meant for human consumption and can cause a range of serious health issues if ingested. Alstra was born out of the 1960s drive to reinvent everyday food. This fat substitute promised guilt-free indulgence without the extra calories. Its introduction coincided with a time when scientific optimism often outpaced regulatory oversight. As the industry celebrated a marvel of chemical engineering, food safety protocols were only just beginning to catch up, leaving a gap that allowed unanticipated health concerns to emerge. Consumers embraced Alstra for its novelty and promise of a lighter future, even as emerging reports hinted at severe gastrointestinal distress. Laboratory findings eventually revealed that, while free of traditional fat calories, this compound could disrupt the absorption of essential vitamins and cause digestive discomfort. This paradox, a product engineered to aid dietary goals that ultimately compromised nutritional well-being, became a cautionary tale in modern food history. Interestingly, advertisements once lauded Alstra as the solution for those seeking to enjoy their favorite snacks without compromise. However, as adverse effects accumulated, both scientists and regulators pushed for tighter safety measures, marking a significant turning point in food additive scrutiny. In the 1970s, margarine had secured its place as the healthier alternative to butter. It was cheaper, lasted longer, and, thanks to trans fats, stayed solid at room temperature while giving baked goods that perfect flakiness. Fast food chains and restaurants took full advantage, using partially hydrogenated oils for frying everything from French fries to fried chicken. The result? Crispy, golden perfection with a long shelf life. But what seemed like a miracle ingredient turned out to be a silent killer. Trans fats raised bad cholesterol, lowered good cholesterol, and increased the risk of heart disease, without people even realizing it. For decades, the food industry brushed off concerns, marketing margarine as a healthier alternative while deep fryers across America sizzled with heart-clogging oils. The science was catching up, though, and by the early 2000s, studies confirmed what researchers had suspected for years. Trans fats were among the worst fats you could consume. Regulations followed, and by 2015, the FDA officially declared trans fats unsafe. Companies scrambled to reformulate products, and today, margarine isn't what it used to be. While fried food never went out of style, the days of trans fat-loaded cooking oils are over. Now, sassafras tea was a beverage that most people had considered a very old tradition. Despite that, you may have never heard of it. This was something you would most commonly see in the Appalachian regions and the rural South. Native Americans were the first ones to ever introduce the settlers to the plant, and it was a very popular folk medicine. A lot of Native Americans put a lot of stock in its fever-managing, blood-purifying qualities. Back then, fevers were just about as common as zits, so having handy little herbal remedies was a godsend. It was really cheap, it was always available, even in grocery stores and medicine shops, and it was very easy to make. You could get dried sassafras root, and that was it. You might be surprised that people often had it with root beer, though. A pint of Hires or A&W along with your tried and tested root remedy was actually a pretty common pairing for people. Plus, traditional root beer recipes were made with sassafras, so that's also why it went together really well. It wasn't until studies found out that sassafras contain safrole in it, which is pretty harmful to your liver. In the leanest years of the Great Depression, nothing edible went to waste. Not even the parts most people today wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, like boiled squirrel heads. This peculiar dish, particularly favored in southern Appalachia, involved simmering squirrel heads slowly, extracting tender meat from cheeks and even brains, both prized as delicacies rich in nutrients. Preparation required patience, typically slow-boiled with salt, onions, and herbs until the meat easily slipped off the bone, a culinary adventure often joked about as the original head-to-tail eating philosophy. Eating squirrel heads wasn't merely a quirky rural curiosity, but a necessity-driven culinary solution. During times when meat was scarce, discarding any edible part was economically unthinkable. However, modern regulations strongly discourage consuming squirrel brains, not merely because it's unsettling dinner table conversation, but due to legitimate health concerns. Studies revealed a disturbing connection between squirrel brain consumption and a rare, fatal neurological disorder known as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a cousin of the infamous mad cow disease. Processed meats have long been a fixture of the American diet, offering convenience, affordability, and a satisfying smoky flavor. But there was one key ingredient that made these meats last longer and look more appetizing: sodium nitrate. In the 1960s, it was used liberally in everything from bacon to hot dogs, ensuring bright red hues and extended shelf life. Few questioned what made their deli meat so vibrant, but as science advanced, concerns began to emerge. At the time, food preservation was a priority, and sodium nitrate was seen as a practical solution. It prevented bacterial growth and gave processed meats a signature cured taste. However, researchers later discovered a darker side. When exposed to high heat, sodium nitrate could form nitrosamines, compounds linked to cancer in animal studies. While a single ham sandwich wasn't a cause for alarm, a lifetime of consuming highly processed meats raised significant health concerns. By the 1970s, regulatory agencies stepped in, limiting nitrate levels and requiring careful monitoring. While still legal today in controlled amounts, many consumers now seek nitrate-free options. The story of sodium nitrate serves as a reminder that food science is constantly evolving. In the 1970s, home canning was more than just a hobby. It was a way to stretch the grocery budget and keep the pantry stocked year-round. Families filled their shelves with jars of green beans, corn, and carrots, all preserved with time-tested methods passed down through generations. But while fruits and jams could be safely canned with a boiling water bath, low-acid vegetables were another story. Without a pressure cooker, those innocent-looking jars could turn into ticking time bombs for botulism. For years, many home canners relied on boiling water alone, believing that if it's sealed, it was safe. Some added aspirin or vinegar, thinking it would help ward off bacteria. Others simply trusted the process. After all, their grandparents had done it. The problem? Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria behind botulism, thrives in low oxygen, low-acid environments like improperly canned vegetables. It doesn't change the taste, smell, or appearance of food, making it nearly impossible to detect until symptoms appear. As cases of botulism poisoning mounted, food safety officials began cracking down, emphasizing the need for pressure canning. It did, however, still have the coca leaf extract. The very earliest Coca-Cola recipes from the 1880s had small amounts of cocaine from coca leaves, and back then it was pretty common. By 1904, though, amidst growing substance abuse concerns, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was passed, making cocaine officially illegal. By the 50s, the drink was stimulant-free, but cocaine comes from those leaves and the extract they're still using, so what gives? Well, this was a little technical and legal loophole. The Stepan Company was one company that operated during this time and had a nice arrangement with the United States government. It was given the right to import coca leaves, albeit under government supervision, and only as long as all traces of cocaine were extracted. These drained leaves would then be used as a flavoring. This agreement and this company still stand today, and the agreement was even reinforced in 1986. Plus, they had to spend an incredible amount of effort and time rebranding Coca-Cola's image. By the 50s, people hadn't forgotten its powdery past, but they were starting to. That's how it's turned into the mainstream family drink you have in your refrigerator today. In an era when practicality trumped sentimentality, even the family pet wasn't always off-limits as a main course. Pet rabbits for meat became common during the Great Depression, as families raised them not just for fluffy companionship, but also as a convenient dinner solution. Surprisingly tender and mild-tasting, rabbit meat was commonly fried, stewed, or baked into pies after soaking overnight in buttermilk or vinegar to reduce gamminess. Because nothing ruins a Depression-era Sunday dinner quite like unwanted backyard flavor. Raising rabbits was uniquely economical, as these fluffy companions conveniently doubled as livestock, feeding on grass and garden scraps and multiplying at legendary speeds. There's a reason we still joke about rabbits' reproductive enthusiasm today. However, attitudes toward rabbits changed dramatically in post-war America. As people increasingly viewed these long-eared animals strictly as cuddly household companions rather than dinner options, cultural taboos strengthened significantly. Modern urban zoning regulations often explicitly forbid slaughtering animals considered pets, making it not just socially questionable but legally risky to prepare rabbit dinners at home in populated areas. Preserving. Have you ever felt so hungry you thought you could take down a whole horse? Well, in the 1950s, that wasn't just a piece of hyperbole, it was a very literal statement. While horse meat never really rose to the heights a tenderloin steak or blue crabs did, it was something that people warmed up to more and more as economic strife and being a U.S. citizen started going hand in hand. Do you remember how we were just talking about trans fats being rooted in World War II-era food rationing strategies? Yeah, that whole period really induced a new way of thinking when it came to food. People were doubling down on making the most of whatever they had and opening their horizons to things they had previously been really dismissive of. Horse meat had a pretty bad reputation, especially since most Americans had a sentimental view of horses. They were pets. They were your next best friend after dogs, they were great workers, and they were beautiful animals you could write poetry about. I think we romanticize anything we can ride into the sunset. But anyway, horse meat started to become a pretty common alternative to beef. Butcher shops would even change the name to have an easier time selling it. But most people started to pick up on the fact that cheval wasn't really real meat. Plus, as technology developed and replaced traditional agricultural methods, a lot of farmers found that they had no real use for all the horses they had anymore. And, well, I know I said they were your second closest bestie, but you'd be surprised what people will do to have fewer mouths to feed, especially if it feeds. In the mid-20th century, sweetness wasn't just a preference, it was a selling point. Few products embodied this better than sweetened condensed milk with excessive sugar. A staple in many households, this thick, syrupy dairy product was beloved for its versatility, affordability, and long shelf life. It made its way into pies, coffee, and even baby formula. But for all its convenience, there was one problem. Some brands packed in so much sugar that it was closer to candy than milk. During the 1960s, food manufacturers weren't required to disclose sugar content as rigorously as they are today. Without standardized labeling, some versions contained sugar levels far beyond what would now be considered safe for daily consumption. The excess wasn't just about taste, it was a cheap preservative, extending the product's shelf life and making it more appealing to budget-conscious shoppers. But as studies linked high sugar intake to obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, health experts began sounding the alarm. By the late 20th century, regulations introduced stricter labeling requirements and sugar content in condensed milk was brought under control. Before pasteurized eggs became the standard, Raw eggs were a common ingredient in homemade recipes, especially in rich, creamy dishes like eggnog and mayonnaise. It was just how things were done. Grandma didn't think twice about cracking a fresh egg straight into the blender to whip up a batch of silky mayo or stirring raw yolks into a holiday eggnog that packed as much punch as the bourbon inside it. It was tradition, and nobody questioned it until they had to. By the late 20th century, food safety experts started raising alarms about the growing risk of salmonella contamination. Unlike today's commercially pasteurized eggs, the ones sitting in a 1970s fridge came straight from the farm, sometimes with a little extra nature still on the shell. A contaminated egg here and there wasn't enough to stop the show, until outbreaks became harder to ignore. By the 1990s, regulations tightened, and pasteurized eggs became the safer choice. Despite the risks, plenty of old-school cooks still swear by the taste and texture of raw egg mayo and eggnog. Some argue pasteurization dulls the flavor, while others simply miss the thrill of living on the edge. Potted meat is something that's definitely not a niche or something Americans are unfamiliar with. As our history says, we've actually been potted meatheads for quite a while now. It was one of the most widely available sources of protein in most American homes after all, to the point that the most popular companies became household names. Whether you were using Armour's Tangier meat or Underwood's slightly saltier ones, it was a spreadable meat product that made the difference between going to bed hungry and going to bed somewhat full. Unlike Spam or corned beef, though, potted meat was pureed and made into almost a mesh of meat instead of anything firm or very chewable. Now you might be wondering what sodium nitrate is doing here, since potted meat is already meant to be a way of preserving it. Industry standards called for more security, though, and preservatives like nitrate help to keep large-scale batches from spoiling. That's no reason to put 300 to 500 milligrams of the stuff per serving, though. I mean, that's enough to really cause some cancer-related issues. While you can still get this nitrate-infused potted meat today, the concentration is a lot lower than it was before thanks to the backlash people gave. We're going to pause for a second and kind of go back to the start. When desperation tightened its grip in the Great Depression, even the backyard robins and sparrows became fair game. Commonly known as songbirds, these feathered neighbors found themselves starring unwillingly in Depression-era dishes. Families employed homemade snares, nets, and carefully aimed slingshots to secure their tiny meals. Once captured, the birds, typically robins, sparrows, or blackbirds, were plucked, gutted, and roasted whole over open fires or baked with potatoes and onions into miniature pies. Interestingly, a 1930s household recipe even recommended skewering songbirds, seasoning lightly, and cooking rapidly, likely the original, less glamorous predecessor to today's fancy hors d'oeuvres. But this culinary trend, born purely of necessity rather than preference, soon faced heavy legal scrutiny. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act, established earlier but strictly enforced post-Depression, outlawed hunting, capturing, or consuming migratory songbirds to prevent their declining populations. Today, violating these regulations could result in hefty fines or even imprisonment, making songbird skewers a costly dish indeed. Preserving food has always been a challenge, but some solutions turned out to be worse than the problem itself. In the 1960s, some manufacturers used formaldehyde, yes, the same chemical used to embalm corpses, as a preservative in food packaging and even certain processed meats. The reasoning was simple. Formaldehyde could prevent spoilage and extend shelf life, making products more durable for transportation and storage. Unfortunately, what was good for logistics wasn't exactly good for human health. At the time, food safety regulations were still evolving. The long-term effects of exposure to certain chemicals weren't fully understood, and manufacturers often took advantage of the regulatory gaps. Formaldehyde wasn't just a byproduct. It was deliberately applied to some food products, keeping meats from spoiling and even preventing mold growth in baked goods. The catch? It's a known carcinogen and toxic in even small doses. Though its risks were largely unknown to the public, scientists began raising alarms about its potential to cause respiratory issues, digestive distress, and even cancer. By the late 1970s, stricter regulations forced food manufacturers to abandon its use. In the Midwest, especially around Wisconsin, there was a holiday tradition that might make modern food safety inspectors break into a cold sweat. Raw ground beef served on rye bread, often topped with onions and a dash of salt and pepper. Known as Cannibal Sandwiches, this dish wasn't some underground delicacy. It was a staple at family gatherings, particularly around Christmas, when butchers sold the freshest beef and people trusted their local meat markets to provide high-quality, bacteria-free cuts. Eating raw meat might sound risky today, but for decades, it was considered perfectly normal in certain communities. The preparation was simple. Freshly ground beef, preferably from a trusted butcher, was spread onto slices of rye bread, sometimes with a smear of butter or mustard. Some enjoyed it with a side of pickles, others with a cold beer. To those who grew up with it, the taste was rich, the texture smooth, and the risk? Barely a thought. That changed as foodborne illnesses became a growing concern. By the late 20th century, increased cases of E. coli and salmonella made raw beef a serious health hazard. Remember the unpasteurized raw milk? Well, people didn't just use it to drink. They ended up making farm cheese out of it too. It was commonly made in a lot of rural America, especially on family farms and within Amish communities throughout the nation. Safety regulations really weren't what they are now, as you can clearly tell by this point. Raw milk cheeses were considered a way to preserve dairy, while also working as a nice little topping for your meat. Plus, some of them even made enough of the stuff to sell, and they would market it as this all-natural product too. Back then, the dangers of consuming cheese made from unpasteurized milk just weren't well known. Also, this cheese was exceptionally rich and creamy. It had a stronger flavor too, and it would be even better depending on how aged it was. The best one was probably Colby or Jack cheese from the Midwest or California though. At least they were popular until they started causing salmonella, listeria, and brucellosis within the population. This led to a lot more proactive government intervention. The United States Department of Agriculture, for example, started to encourage pasteurization for most cheeses. Throughout the 50s, many states would ban the sale of this kind of cheese, and by the 70s, it got outlawed completely. Before neatly packaged pork chops arrived wrapped in cellophane at supermarkets, families in Depression-era America took matters and meat cleavers into their own hands. Home-slaughtered pigs without inspection weren't just rural tradition, they were economic necessity, a direct route from the backyard pig pen to dinner plates nationwide. Neighbors often gathered together, turning butchering day into a social event, perhaps the original farm-to-table movement, minus the trendy menus. Pork cuts were carefully salted, smoked, cured, or canned in cellars without official oversight, and sausages stuffed by hand provided protein all winter. Interestingly, nearly every part found a use, including rendering fat for lard or transforming scraps into sausage, a testament to Depression-era thriftiness. Yet these home-slaughtered practices carried hidden dangers. Unsupervised slaughter led to contamination risks, including trichinosis outbreaks and food poisoning incidents that pushed authorities toward regulation. Today, selling home-slaughtered pork without USDA inspection isn't just risky. It's illegal nationwide, intended to protect public health and ensure humane animal treatment standards. Canned tuna was cheap, packed with protein, and could be turned into everything from tuna salad sandwiches to casseroles. Families relied on it for quick meals, and no one thought twice about how much they ate. Back then, there were no warning labels, no recommendations to limit consumption, just endless recipes encouraging people to make the most of their pantry supply. But there was a hidden problem. Industrial pollution had been steadily increasing mercury levels in ocean fish, and tuna, being a top predator, was absorbing more than its fair share. By 1970, reports surfaced linking mercury in tuna to potential neurological damage, particularly in pregnant women and young children. The FDA took action, setting limits on mercury levels in fish, but there was no official warning on cans. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the government issued clear guidelines advising consumers, especially expectant mothers, to limit their intake of certain tuna varieties. Despite the concerns, canned tuna never disappeared from store shelves. It's still a go-to meal for millions, but with a little more caution attached. Levels. By the 1960s, soda had become more than just a refreshing treat. It was a cultural icon. With its bold flavors, flashy advertisements, and promises of instant energy, it was a staple of American life. But some brands took that last promise a little too far. High-caffeine soda wasn't just about a quick pick-me-up. Some of these carbonated concoctions packed as much caffeine as several cups of coffee in a single bottle. At a time when regulations were still catching up to the booming food and beverage industry, caffeine content wasn't something most consumers thought to question. For those needing an extra boost, whether for a long shift, a late-night study session, or just to keep up with the fast pace of modern life, these sodas were a tempting choice. But what went down easy didn't always sit well. Excessive caffeine consumption could lead to heart palpitations, anxiety, and even dependency. Some drinkers learned the hard way that too much of a good thing wasn't always a good thing. As research into caffeine's effects grew, regulations tightened. Today, sodas still contain caffeine, but the extreme levels once found in certain brands have been curbed. A crisp autumn day in the 1970s wasn't complete without a trip to the local farm stand. Fresh apples, homemade pies, and of course, a jug of unpasteurized apple cider, cloudy, rich, and straight from the press. It was a seasonal tradition, the kind of drink you poured into a glass and sipped cold, or warmed up on the stove with a cinnamon stick. No labels, no expiration dates, just fresh-pressed fruit in its purest form. For generations, farm-fresh juices were a staple, especially in rural areas where people trusted their local orchards. The juice was made by simply crushing fruit and collecting the liquid. No heat treatment, no extra processing, and because it wasn't filtered, it had that distinct, pulpy texture that store-bought juice just couldn't match. But as food safety research advanced, so did concerns over harmful bacteria like E. coli and salmonella. Unpasteurized juice, while natural, carried risks, especially for children and the elderly. By the 1990s, regulations tightened, requiring warning labels and, in many cases, pasteurization for commercial sale. While you can still find raw cider at some farm stands, it often comes with a disclaimer. Ketchup's near and dear to everyone's hearts, but most of us are used to it being red on its own. In the 50s, though, people actually bought artificially colored ketchup. This was completely red, almost obsessively so. In hindsight, it wasn't that odd for food colorings and synthetic dyes to be used, but towards the 50s, and particularly the end of the 50s, started using all kinds of strong dyes. There was an almost strange obsession with getting the perfect cherry red aesthetic for each ketchup company. All of them were doing this: Hunt's, Del Monte's, and even Heinz. They started to have it in just about every ketchup product they released. This one never really became illegal. It's still something they do to this day. But there definitely was a lot of demand for natural ketchup lately. I kind of get it. It's just a dip made out of tomatoes, so why bother making it extra red? During the hardest days of the Great Depression, families discovered ways to use every bit of available food, including parts that modern cooks might discreetly discard, leading to dishes like blood soup made from chickens or pigs. This thick, savory stew was surprisingly popular, especially among immigrant communities where wasting animal parts was practically a sin. To prepare the soup, fresh blood was immediately whisked with vinegar to prevent clotting, then simmered slowly alongside onions, garlic, spices, and grains, yielding a protein-rich, iron-packed meal designed to stretch tight budgets further than your granddad's wallet on payday. Interestingly, similar dishes remain popular today in European cuisines like Polish czernina or Filipino dinuguan, suggesting Depression-era Americans weren't alone in turning blood into hearty comfort food. But as food safety awareness grew, authorities tightened regulations on dishes using animal blood, citing serious risks of pathogens like salmonella or E. coli if improperly handled. Today, restaurants or commercial kitchens serving blood-based recipes require strict health inspections and special handling permits, meaning grandma's favorite soup might now invite an unwanted visit from the health inspector. Holiday parties in the 1970s weren't complete without a giant bowl of homemade eggnog, rich, creamy, and laced with enough booze to keep the festivities going. It was made the old-fashioned way with fresh eggs, heavy cream, sugar, and a generous pour of rum, brandy, or whiskey. And once mixed, it often sat out for hours, left at room temperature for guests to ladle into their cups all evening long. Refrigeration? That was for leftovers. Eggnog had been made this way for centuries, with the belief that alcohol would kill off any harmful bacteria lurking in the raw eggs. And for the most part, people drank it without issue. Families swore by their own special recipes, passing them down like treasured heirlooms. The longer it sat, the better the flavors blended, or at least that was the logic. But as food safety research advanced, experts started warning that alcohol wasn't the magic disinfectant people thought it was. Raw eggs carried the risk of salmonella, and dairy left out too long could turn an indulgent holiday treat into a fast track to food poisoning. By the late 20th century, pasteurized eggs became the safer choice, and most modern eggnog recipes required refrigeration. Speaking of which, let's dive into another curious food creation that has long since been out of favor: foods preserved using hazardous chemicals. This brings an end to all things illegal but normal to eat in the 1900s. Comment below which radioactive food you would dare to eat, and don't forget to like and subscribe.